Hi, everybody. I'm so glad you're here. I have a lot to say. It was a big life. He lived a long time. So, I'm going to take my time and say many things. So that's just a warning. So I'm going to begin with a pretty big swing and start out like this. God spoke to my father once in a dream. God was low-key and his message was brief. It was this: consider the full humanity of every person you meet, that they fear and love and suffer and dream as deeply as you do. This was my father's faith. Picture him as a 5-year-old with his mother and his aunt and his 2 sisters, Alice and Renee. They'd left Brooklyn because he would find out decades later through letters. His mother left his father, a charmer who struggled with alcoholism, and she took the 3 kids back home to West Virginia. My father's truest church might have been the coal-dusted mountains of his childhood, where the snow turned to ash gray before touching the ground. His father died shortly after in an Army Jeep accident. This was when seatbelts were first this was why, when seatbelts were first invented, he ordered them and installed them in our station wagon, and why, before he drove grandchildren anywhere, each one of them would have to confirm they were buckled up by saying 2 words. Grandkids and family, those 2 words on 3. 1, 2, 3. Correct, ready. It's notable that my father was raised by and among women. He was never taught that crying was a sign of weakness, that a real man was tough and stern, the opposite. He was usually the first to cry, the first to see the good, to forgive, to talk about love. One of his favorite poems was by Jack Kavanaugh, "Some men are too gentle to live among wolves." Make no mistake, my father, the litigator, was a wolf. But when I asked him as a kid if he was sad that, as a man, he could never have babies, he said yes, absolutely. Like his grandson Jimmy and his son-in-law Dave, he'd have loved to have been a stay-at-home dad. But as that 5-year-old, hoping his father was just away on a top-secret mission, my father started to stutter, an effect of trauma. But he said it was like his thoughts were so fast in his mind that his mouth just couldn't keep up. As everyone in this room knows, his mouth eventually caught up. And it caught up to a brilliant mind. A 5-year engineering degree done in 3 years, a law degree from George Washington, classes at night, and working at the U.S. Patent Office by day, 30 years as a DuPont lawyer. My brother Bill always said I learned more from my father at the dining room table than all my years in school. My father would argue a point with you as a kid, always respecting that a kid could argue their side. And if you came around to his side, he'd flip sides to show you how to keep working your point. He was teaching us to have a voice, not only for our own sake, but to speak up for those who couldn't. This was how he loved his neighbor. He used his mind and his voice to advocate for others. He marched for civil rights in the 60s. He wore a black armband to his corporate job to protest the Vietnam War. He marched while pushing me in a stroller. He marched while pushing Theo in a stroller. He marched for women's rights and LGBTQ rights. He did pro bono for the ACLU and defended freedom of religion. He worked as a public defender and the head of the Newark Housing Authority to get justice and housing for the underserved communities. More recently, he wrote letters of support for the civil rights of the transgender community. His favorite part of working at DuPont was, there was woke before this, there was woke. Sensitivity training is what it was called in the 1980s, and he loved it. He learned Native American history, African American history. He got radicalized. It was amazing. He once hugged the postman. We were like, don't. During a session he led, he told everyone in the group this new fact he'd learned, that 1 out of every 10 people is gay or lesbian. He said, so raise your hand if you have someone in your family who's gay or lesbian. And he expected all of them to raise their hands because statistically that was true. But his was the only one to go up, and he was so proud of the people he loved. His intellectual curiosity was vast. When his granddaughter Molly was taking UD class in black holes, he took it with her. When I didn't know how a post-apocalyptic dome for a novel might work, he drew up a blueprint to scale. Dave once idly asked him if he thought the Twin Towers could ever cast infinite parallel shadows. He created a mathematical equation and gave us the answer when Phineas was born. His birth missed the rare event by 7 minutes and 32 seconds. This February, on the anniversary of my parents' first date, he calculated the number of heartbeats that he and my mother had shared over their lives together, with an asterisk, because he likes precision, noting that this calculation had been adjusted for episodes of AFib. In the first 5 books of the Bible alone, there are 36 passages that tell us how we're supposed to welcome foreigners who come to our land seeking refuge, and he walked this walk. I remember roller skating into my house at 11 and finding an Iranian family in our living room. They needed housing and were moving in. 2 years later, my father, in a blizzard, found himself driving that family up the steep hill, very steep hill, to St. Francis Hospital while the mother was in labor. My parents housed 2 sisters fleeing Cuba during Operation Pedro Pan. They opened their home to teachers and students all over the world. Every Christmas, my sister Kate would bring home someone who couldn't go home for the holidays to our house. On weekends, they took in the foster child, Willie Wiley, and helped raise my Uncle Jack's daughter during a difficult time. It was, as Mary Lou Danberg put it, a loud house. Another thing my father excelled at was anti-materialism. Man, he was not interested in fancy things or showing off wealth. In fact, all my childhood, I thought, because of the way they lived, they were stretched pretty thin. One day when I was 16, I drove up with my dad in his Ford Escort, which was missing second gear. And his underling, who he'd been grooming for years, drove up in a Jag. I looked over at my dad and I said, "Hold up. Are we loaded?" But I already knew my father's priorities. He didn't mind spending money, just not on houses or cars or clothes. My God, the Velcro sneakers. But experiences, education, travel, theater, skiing. I was taken to more theater in 1 year of my childhood than most people in their entire lives. Good theater, Broadway, but also really bad theater. Community plays in shit towns that we were just rolling through on vacation. He kept every play he ever saw on an index card, probably 2,000, and there are stacks of them held together in taut rubber bands in his desk drawer. He was happy to pay for ski vacations too. A few days ago, my sister Melanie said to my brother, both lifelong skiers, what would our lives have been like if he hadn't given us that gift? He loved art, and he was so proud of our talents. Melanie's paintings, Billy's years as a jazz saxophonist, Kate's acting, directing, producing, that writer-daughter of his who goes on too long. He also loved math, science, law, logic, heroism. His children and grandchildren excel in so many areas: mathematics, leadership, entrepreneurship, film, television making, filmmaking, as teachers, thinkers, comedic TikTokers, advocates, outdoorsmen working in the great outdoors he loved so much in national parks. Financial wizards, genius programmers, incredible athletes, yogis, skiers, fashionistas, devoted mothers and fathers, and even one cowboy. He loved watching the careers of his grandchildren take shape, all of their talents and drive made manifest. But it is actually impossible for me to tell the story of my father's life without also telling a love story. On an unseasonably warm day in February in D.C., my parents met at a picnic. They fell in love completely and utterly. And when my dad took my mom home to meet his mother and later privately told his mother that he was going to marry that redheaded girl, his mother ran upstairs to welcome my mother to the family. But since my mother hadn't yet been asked, this was their engagement story, so his mother proposed for him. When he went home to meet her parents, my grandfather took him into a back room, pulled out a German Luger that he'd won in a bet. My father was wondering if he was going to get shot, but it turned out that this was just my grandfather's way of welcoming my dad into my mother's deeply Southern family. My parents have been married for 64 years, and it's strange to have been raised by people who are so very much in love. The way they sat close, held hands, told us as kids not to bother them because they were going to their bedroom to work through the Christmas lists. Like most Catholic couples in the 70s, they went to marriage encounter retreat where they separated husbands and wives but could write letters to each other. My mother gave me those letters years later, and they revealed two people homesick for each other. I'm not saying they didn't bicker. They bickered. But they could bicker and then so quickly mend. They had their own language running beneath everything, a language that the two of them shared, sometimes only in a glance. As Holly Ballard wrote me a few days ago about my father, she simply said, as Kim mentioned, the way he looked at Glenda. Imagine, my mother got to look at my father and be looked at like that for a lifetime. My father's a dad. He played Foursquare with us in the street, still in his suit and tie. And he made incredibly litigious rules that were very complex for young children to understand. He was the first one to take off running if the frisbee landed on Old Man Hoffman's lawn. Some of the kids and grandkids might remember the treasure map full of the jar of pennies, which, by the way, might still be buried in our yard. The Thanksgiving Day tradition of making bows and arrows to go turkey hunting, how palpably my father could make a group of kids believe they saw a turkey through the trees and how close they'd come to shooting it. He was such a beloved player of games in the neighborhood that little Jessica Altavote said, "When I have a baby, I'm going to name it Mr. Baggott." She did not, by the way, do that. But my sister Kate did name a child after my dad, and my father loved and adored his namesake William. When he retired as early as possible at the age of 56, he went on to become a pilot, Sinclair's pop-up airplane, a novelist of fantasy trilogy, a historical fiction based on our family genealogy. He tracked down our ancestors, a sheep thief who was given two options, go to a penal colony or get hanged as an Englishman. He chose the former. Elizabeth Green, who survived a massacre. The Baggotts, who were sponsored by an unmarried auntie whose money source was never quite revealed. And these weird Baggotts who, to this day, host a horn dancing ceremony, I swear, where people show up at their little mini castle wearing racks of antlers. I love it so much. He had our family crest motto translated, and it turned out to be, "We take what's ours." It was just more menacing than he'd been expecting. So he asked for another translator, and someone else said it could be closer to "we keep what's ours," which he accepted. He took a trip to the Czech Republic after the fall of the USSR, and as a professor of law and democracy, he and Glenda traveled the world. He was a funny, wry friend to the Harts, the Murrays, the O'Keeffes, McCormicks, Jack Sherritts, and so many more. He was an outdoorsman who never lost his love of the mountains, notably Cranny Crow at Lost River. Before you book there is no river, it's lost. And the Berkshires. He was a wedding officiant for Lorelei and Lev, an Irishman with an Irish passport, a researcher for his demanding novelist daughter, a tireless carpooler, especially when Trish was pregnant with the twins. He's the one who shows up after the infant gets out of the NICU with instructions to be held upright for weeks, and he held that baby for hours and hours and hours. I'm now just going to move to snapshots because we just got to go snapshots. He established a one-strike freebie rule for my brother's buddies during college, so some of you might have been bailed out of jail and represented by him in court, maybe for using language unbefitting a gentleman in a public sphere in a hat you forgot to purchase. When Dr. Glassner asked him if he was exercising, my dad explained that he did. He was dancing every day at Cropalo in the Berkshires, where my parents summered. Noon dance, he said. But Glassner heard nude dance. And for decades, Glassner would bring up my father's naked dancing exercises, and my father never corrected him. When my dad was young, he took a date to a gambling boat. He had no money to do any gambling, so he told her it was unethical for him to gamble because he always won. Basically, he told her he was magic. She told him to prove it, and he kept begging off, and she kept urging, and finally, out of options, he put a coin in a slot machine, and as the money just came pouring out, he shrugged solemnly and said, "See?" I asked him if he had a backup plan, and he said, "Why would I have needed a backup plan?" Because he was magic. He once got locked in a Parisian parking garage at the start of a long weekend, and he had the courage to scream at the top of his lungs for help. It's not easy to admit a weakness in front of Parisians like that. Because before any of us would back out of a driveway with our kids, he'd first stand in front of the car, and he would crank the engine, and then the car would start. He applied for NASA as an astronaut, but they just wanted him to do patent work. He rolled down windows and mooed at passing cows. He entertained guests by dropping a raw egg on shag carpeting to show off DuPont's Give and Go carpet padding. The eggs always bounced, except that time they didn't, and it is not easy getting raw egg out of a shag. As most of you know, my father danced every day, even in the days before he died. As a kid, when I came home from dance classes, he'd ask me to teach him everything. He did a great jitterbug, a not bad moonwalk. He loved to dance like Zorba the Greek in the kitchen. I taught him this spin move that ended like that. And when he'd pick me up in a crowded airport, all I had to do was look for the big guy going like that, and then I'd do that. He never let a racist or homophobic joke float by unchecked. He always offered to carry the baby for the mom who was flying alone and walk the baby up and down the aisle so she could eat and rest. He was the great baby whisperer. When the neighbor, Sally Brown, invited my folks to a New Year's Eve party, he declined by saying, "My wife and I have a tradition of our own." I was born 9 months later. Because my mother's obstetrician was at lunch when she was giving birth, he caught me on the way out. And as you can all attest, he was good at catching people when they needed him. And I want to circle back to my father's dream. My father did this, and when you were with him, he was seeing the full you. Because he was an optimist, he was seeing the best in you. And that is not only being known, which is, to me, the greatest and truest gift we can give each other, but he was also reflecting back a vision of you that was what you most wanted to be. And if we all did that, if that were a dedicated practice that as many of us could share, we would one by one see in each other a full humanity and a most optimistic humanity. And in a desire to sustain that vision of ourselves, we would become a little bit better. And if each of us were just a little bit better, the world would be better. He lives on because so much of the good of us is an echo in the good of him. And he's not gone, because as all of you know, as Baggotts, we keep what's ours. And I will one day see my father again in a crowd. And he will do this. And I will do this. But now he's on a journey, and each of us is on a journey. So I'm gonna crank the car. And if you all would join me in shouting, "Correct, ready." One more time, on 3. 1, 2, 3. Correct, ready.